There's a buzz in the literary world as Anna Todd's conclusion of the Brightest Stars series comes out this month. We got to sit down with Anna and learn more about how she got her start, what it means to close out a beloved series, and what she is doing to help other writers get their chance. Enjoy the episode and read The Infinite Light of Dust, the third installment of the Brightest Star series. Anna, thank you for being with us. It's so nice to meet you. We are Women in Entertainment are huge fans, and
Thank you.
we're big readers and love recommending books and talking about books. We have actually a little section of our company called the Book Nook, because when everybody we talked to, whether they were an actor, a writer, director, person, we always ended up talking about books. What were books we were reading? Who are our favorite authors? And then obviously book to screen and all of that. So we love it anytime that we're able to talk to a writer. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh, thank you. I love that. I feel like every aspect of my life somehow always comes back to books too. Like no matter what the topic is, there's some way to bring it back to books.
Which is the best. It's so great, and I love the fact that. And I'm not a book snob. I'm not oh, it has to be a physical book. Oh, it has to be my iPad. Oh, it's this anywhere, everywhere, hardback, paperback, whatever it may be. So it is. It's just so fun to hear people talking about reading and how. I mean, anytime I go to my little local bookstore or Barnes and Noble or they're packed. And it's so
Yeah.
great. It's so great how many people are, and even now, like I travel a lot for work and things, and everybody's reading. Everybody's reading, and it's so great to see like those physical books back in everyone's hands.
Yeah, I love it. Honestly, there was a little bit of time. I mean, I've been a reader my whole life, but it's definitely ebbed and flowed,
Yeah,
especially with other people and what they're doing. And I love it, even just as a reader, not even a writer, but now it's like for a little bit, I felt like people were either not reading so much, or maybe it was the whole like instantaneous Netflix stuff going on, which I love a good Netflix series, but
yeah,
there was just like a little time where it felt like there wasn't enough reading, and then now it's like everyone, and I think it has
yeah.
to do with social media, and it's just really cool, all these adaptations coming out where I have a lot of people that even just friends of mine that were never readers, and they'll see Bridgerton or something and be like, I can't believe that was a book series, and then they go back and buy all the books, so it's really cool.
Right? Yeah, no, I think I love that now it can go full circle. It used to be that if you didn't read the books first, then and you watch the series, you would never go back to the books.
Yeah.
And I think now you're exactly right. People aren't afraid to keep going back and forth, whichever way wherever they caught it first, they're not afraid to go back the other way.
Yeah, and I think even just amongst the reader space, there's been a shift with the whole like the book is better. I mean, people still say that obviously, and I very much stand by that. But I think a lot of readers and authors, even that read, were
Mhm.
separating them so much
Yeah,
more than the like Harry Potter days or Game of Thrones, where people were so up in arms over the books or this or Twilight, for example, is like
right.
madhouse. But it's like now we can all appreciate like Twilight books are totally different in a good way.
Yeah,
And the films are, I love them. So I'm like, but they're
yeah,
masterpieces to me. They're like classics. But there
right.
is definitely more open dialogue as opposed to before. It was like you're either a book fan or a movie fan, and there's no in
Yeah.
between.
Yeah. We had this conversation with someone not too long ago, and I think a big piece that's helped that is the series option, where
Mhm.
you don't feel like you have to take this beloved book and it has to be 2 hours. Can't be 1 minute longer than 2 hours. And now that we have, like you said, Bridgerton and Game of Thrones, where it can, you feel like you can evolve the characters and you can take those beloved books and it can be 8 hours of content or 12 hours of content in these series. I think that gets like keeps the readers calm down a little bit, that we can
Yeah, definitely.
that we can see those people. um so before we get into your book, your conclusion on your Brightest Stars series, will you take us back a little bit to when you started writing, and I want to get into your actual. We're big fans of the Wattpad group. They're friends of women in entertainment, so that's so exciting. But even before that, did you write as a child? Did you come is your family creative? How did you, even before you started your after series? How did you what was the atmosphere that led you to become a writer?
I mean, my family's not really creative. My mom, in her own way, is creative. The older I get, the more I realize, but it's more in the form of I come from a very low income, very addiction filled family, just to be really transparent. So
Mhm,
I think it was a lot of escapism when I was a
mhm,
kid.
mhm,
And that's when it started, was just like leaving the real world and going into this fictional world, whether it was, at the library or like stealing books from my school and then returning them. But my mom is creative in a way where she'll like make a dragon out of a stick or whatever. So I'm like, the older I get and the more I like come to terms with our relationship and who she is as a person, I'm like, she actually is really creative, just in a different way.
mhm,
But I wasn't, as a kid, I never really, given the environment I was in, there wasn't really a lot of room to like daydream or dream. I mean, daydreaming existed for me a lot, but the idea of being a writer was so ridiculously far fetched that I didn't even consider it for a second.
mhm,
I wanted to be a teacher, but even that was too, I knew growing up that, I wouldn't be able to go to college. And if I did, I would either go straight into debt, which again, with the way I was raised, that I was like, no way am I
mhm,
doing that. So I was like, okay, I've got to try to find some way to just like pay my bills and like have fun in my life. So I didn't really dream of being a writer. Honestly, I wish sometimes when I get asked this, I'm like, oh, it would be so nice to say like, oh, ever since I was a little girl, I dreamed of the day my book would be published. But it wasn't that way. It was just, I loved reading. I remember when my son was born, I was a waitress and I worked at Ulta, like retail store, and did a bunch of side jobs. And I remember being like, I really wish I could get paid to read because that was the only thing that I like. Like I don't do any, I have no other hobbies literally besides reading. So I'm like, that would be so cool to get paid to read. And I didn't even know that there was this whole blogger sphere because I wasn't really, ironically enough, given my Wattpad start, I wasn't really into social media at all. Like I was very much like, it was like terrifying to me. I'm like, a bunch of people with their like instantaneous opinions is just not something I was interested in, even though I was only 20. But then I found Wattpad and that launched a whole other thing. But I was very much not expecting to be a writer. Even as I was writing, I didn't really connect the two, that I was actually creating a book. I just felt like I was like telling a story on the internet.
mhm. And when did that realization hit? Because as you if the numbers that I'm reading aren't correct, but as you were posting chapter by chapter, I mean, in total now they have over 1 billion views. I mean, that's like a B. That is a
Yeah.
crazy number. So when did that shift to be like, oh my God, this is something?
It took me a little bit, honestly. And in time wise, it wasn't that long before I had 1 million reads. And I remember I was driving to San Antonio. I lived in Texas at the time, and no one knew I was writing this at all. No one knew. And my mother in law at the time, I'm recently divorced, but it's great. It's not I can talk about it. And I'm still very close with my ex mother in law, but she's incredible. Um, and we were driving to San Antonio, and I was like, I got on just at the gas station because I got so used to like commenting back and checking my Wattpad and like how long's it been since I uploaded and all of that stuff. And it was such a community place. So it just became like my social media basically. And I checked it and it said like 1 million reads. And I was like, oh my God, I was like 1 million. And I knew it was getting close to that, but it just, I don't want to say didn't care about the numbers because that's very like privileged thing to say, but it still felt so small because Wattpad, especially, I mean, now it's evolved and there's all these adaptations and it's a humongous company, especially now joining hands with Webtoon. It's like this massive thing, but it just felt so isolated in the best way that it felt like this tiny group of people. So I just could not comprehend the fact that there were 1 million reads on the story. And I think the moment I realized, even before I knew anything was going to happen with publishing or anything like that, I used to comment back to every single comment. Like, even if it was like, I love this chapter, I hate this chapter. And after probably only about a month, but it still felt like way longer, but in real time, it was probably a month. I started being like, I can't do that. I was spending like 7 hours a day talking to people
Mhm.
online, which I'm like, I had a newborn child my son has a lot of medical issues. He has epilepsy, but he was having 10 to 50 seizures a day. So it's like my baby's here and then I'm typing and then I'm like, it was just a lot. That was when I was like, wait, this is unmanageable in the best way where I can't even respond to all the people. In the beginning, I knew everyone by name and it was like this little group. So I think that's when it kind of clicked of like, wait, this is bigger than this little Wattpad community that I have. Now it's this massive Wattpad community.
That's a no. That's amazing. So for people who don't know that, Wattpad of self-publishing and fan fiction, and then what was the next evolution of, you know, publishing for you? What was the next evolution kind of the business side of your books, or of your first series?
Yeah. So I was writing on Wattpad, which is an online publishing platform for anyone who doesn't know. And I was reading there also. So
Mhm.
I was writing pretty much a chapter a day, which is not very common.
Oh my
And the pressure of it actually helped me so much. Like I miss being able to because the writing, it's like you have thousands of people being like, update now, what are you doing? So the pressure kept me going, and I really do work very well under pressure. And I'm a very fast learner, so I was like, okay, I need to update, or like I'm gonna get all of these borderline abusive comments, but here we are. But it kept me going. And then I started talking to Wattpad because the story got so big that they were like, you know, what do you want to do with this? And I'm like,
Mhm.
what can I do with it? What do you mean? I don't know. And I knew, 50 Shades of Grey was published as Twilight fan
Right.
fiction. And I know other authors, especially now I realized that most of my favorite books, especially indie authors, were all Twilight fan fiction,
Mhm.
which seems to be like a constant theme in my life. It always comes back to Twilight somehow. Um, and I was like, oh, yeah, I'll have a Skype with you with Wattpad. And they didn't know anything about me because I was very private about my life and my name and my age, even. And because it's the internet, it's like a scary place. So I was like,
Right.
what's the point in telling anyone about my life when this is just a story on the internet? So Wattpad contacted me and they were like, first of all, like, how old are you? Where are you from? Where do you live? Would you want to talk about the next steps? And I was like, okay. And when I first got their email, I ignored it like twice because I was like, I'm not even sure if this is really someone from Wattpad. And it just felt like, even though at the end of the email it said like at Wattpad, so obviously it was, but I was just like, this is like, it didn't make any sense to me. I was like, this is strange, but okay. And then I remember having a Skype with them and they were going over all these big publishers, which as a reader, I knew the names of, but I was like, we're talking about, like Simon and Schuster and all these big publishers where I was like, they want to publish a book that's a fan fiction from a writer with absolutely no credentials, no experience. Like, okay. And then it went very quickly. I went to their office and I had never left the country before. So I had to get like a same day passport in Dallas, which was quite the adventure with a baby. And I lived like 4 hours from Dallas. So it was a whole thing. And then I went to their office in Canada. And then pretty shortly after that, we went to New York, met with all of these publishers. And at the time, I didn't know anything about the process, but I'm very much a sponge. So I was like kind of mentally taking notes of the things that I already was like, oh, this feels very old fashioned, or this is not as modern as especially being used to the Wattpad model. I was like, this is some of the stuff they would say, or like the ways they would try to impress me is like I remember, I won't say who, but one of the editors that I got to meet has done incredible work, but I get to the office and it's like all these like fancy, like the whole table is like full of all these donuts and all these lattes and like flowers. And I'm like, this is totally not like, if you read my story and you like even, I don't know, read my, because I used to make these like author notes at the bottom. It's like, what about me says I need you to spend all this money and waste all of this food and all this, like, it's like, first of all, I'm too nervous to eat all your fancy donuts anyways. But I just was like, some of this stuff didn't make sense to me. So I was like kind of making mental notes.
Mhm.
And then there was the whole, do we take it off of Wattpad or do we not? And that was one of my things that I obviously Wattpad supported because they didn't want me to take it off the platform, but I felt very strongly about not removing it because first of all, I didn't set out to make this a career. And at this time, I still didn't even know that it would actually make any money or anything like that. So I'm like, why would I remove something that other people by reading it have helped me even be in this office? But there were just some editors that were so confused on like, why would you keep the story up for free? It's going to affect sales. And it's like, well, do you want it or not? So I was very adamant about that, but I found the perfect editor. And I thought at the time that every author gets to go to all these editors and have them pitch themselves. And then I started meeting authors and telling them, and they're like, I wouldn't tell that story to people. Cause I'm like, yeah. And so was like, got these donuts and blah, blah. And they were like, you like, because usually it's reversed. For those of you who don't know, it's like very much reversed. Like you get an agent, which I didn't have an agent until like all of my first series was published. I was just working like on my own and then having Wattpad help, but it was very much the opposite in every way of a normal publishing story. So I kind of learned as I went because at the time Wattpad had never published anyone, and my story still is the biggest, most read story on the platform. But since then, they have tons of books out and films and all the things. But at the time we were all just kind of going with the flow.
Anna, what was it like to like your first day, like opening up Wattpad and writing? Like what made you take that leap? Like for other authors in our network and who are intimidated or, that obviously not familiar, maybe not familiar with Wattpad or are, what was that first jump to say, no, I'm gonna start writing today?
I honestly think a big part of it was that it was so anonymous. It's so, and it still is. It can, if you want it to be, it is. So for me, I didn't really think it through that much. Honestly, I was reading on there for a while and I realized that most of the stories that I loved, and I was a huge reader of, traditionally published books, self-published books, indie, all over the place. So I'll read anything as long as it keeps my attention. But all of these incredible stories I was reading on Wattpad, at the end of the chapter, a lot of writers used to put, like a little author's note of like an update on their life. Or I remember one of them I was reading, it was my favorite one. And at the end of her chapter, it was like, I have finals tomorrow. She was like a junior in high school. She was like, I have finals tomorrow. And I was like, this is a teenager writing this, and the story, the way it was written. And I was just like, this is so incredible that everyone that I was reading was just, a regular person. They had day jobs, they had families, or they had, obligation. It's like nobody was very experienced or had this creative writing degree or mentors or all of the fancy words that I've learned since. But I think that took a big, just, I don't know, the anxiety or the fear out of it, because I was like, why would I, like, who cares? No one's going to read it. It was my thought. It was like, no one's going to read it. And I was reading at such a rapid pace on the platform that I didn't run out of things to read, but in the exact genre and the type of books, like I was very into like enemies to lovers and angsty and like super dramatic romance. So I felt like I had like read them all. So I was like, and I kept thinking of this like girl in college, and I was like, why not? Like, might as well. My son's asleep. And so I didn't really plan it either. I remember it was a Sunday, and I remember the feeling like once I started typing and like opening up the actual like create story page, because I'd never even done it before. So I was like, it's actually pretty easy. Like, this isn't so bad. And my laptop was like missing. I used this laptop that was missing like 5 keys for writing the entire series. So like I'm still triggered sometimes when I type. I get these like random flashbacks of like what it was like to not have an S and like a P and an L, which are like, those were the 3 most crucial. So it drove me crazy. But financially, I just wasn't in a place to have, a MacBook or, anything like that. So I had what I had, and I used it. But it was honestly just a typical day where I was like, might as well. No one's going to know. No one's going to read it. Like, who cares? And now I'm so glad that I did that. And I always tell people when they ask, like, what's your biggest advice on taking that leap? It's like, we're all just doing whatever we are doing in our lives. Like, no one cares as much as you do, which is a good and bad thing. But it's like,
Yep.
especially somewhere like Wattpad, it's like you upload it, people might read it, they might not. If they don't like it, they'll typically just move to another story. It's the same thing as like what gives you the courage. You know, I worked at Waffle House, which was the hardest job I've ever had in my life. And it's like that job, it's like it took more courage to yell a hash brown order in front of a crowded restaurant at 3 a.m. as a teenager than it did to upload the chapter. So it's like, I think everything in life, whether it's like going to a new coffee shop or trying a new food, it's like everything takes some amount of courage. If I'm going to, dictate what is going to get my strength or bravery, it's definitely should be something that can change my life or make me feel good, even if it wouldn't have made itself into a career. It's like I would rather be afraid and do something that makes me feel really good and happy than never know what it's like, because I definitely don't want to be, 70 years old thinking, man, I really wish I would have wrote that book, which fortunately now I could just write it even if I am 70. But I didn't really have a lot of doubts about it because it's like, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And I'm just doing it for fun and distraction.
That's just such a great lesson. And you hear that so often, and not just from writers, is, one bad page is better than no pages at all. Or one
100%.
almost there page is, just, that almost that great's the enemy of good, really sits in the minds of a lot of writers or potential writers, where it's just like, just get something out there, get that first page out there. And you can always change it, you can always edit, but you can't, you don't have anything to work with if you don't ever do it.
Yeah. And that feeling of, I have so many friends who are either bloggers that want to write, or they've written one story, but they won't let anyone read it. And it's like that feeling, even though I just took the leap, but I'm like I said, I'm a sponge. So if someone's feeling something, I like feel it to my core. And I'm like, it's not even me. And I already feel that like heaviness of like, do you really want to do that? Especially some of my friends who, one, for example, it's like she spends her entire life on her day job and she puts all of her energy into someone else's company, and she's always just taking care of her, like everyone around her. And I'm like, if you just take 1 hour of your day every day and even upload it or send it to a friend, send it to me. She won't send it to me because she's like, whatever. But I'm like, send your story to someone, post it on the internet, even post it. I've seen people doing stuff like posting just on Kindle, or just, it's like, if you take one of those hours that you're spending on everyone else and put it on yourself, your life will change. Even if it's not this massive, financial success, you will feel so good. And in the long term, it's like especially as women, it's like we give so much to everyone else around us, but we're so afraid to pour anything back into ourselves without feeling selfish or guilt, or like we're not doing what we should be doing, when in reality, it's like, how many hours of our day do we spend on other people?
No, 100%. So with that series, becoming such a huge success, and you moved in, you're moving to a publisher. It's been graphic novels, it's been made into movies, it's all this. How do you feel differently about now, writing now, where like you said, it was for you, and it was an outlet, and it was, your upbringing and your baby and all of these things that, you could do this for yourself. Have you been able to hold on to that, or how is it different now that it's a job, a career? It's a huge successful career.
I mean, it changes all the time, honestly. Some days I'm like, oh, I miss when it was just simple and I could just upload something on the internet when I feel like it and people can read it. And I miss having the feedback, especially because now, because of all my contracts and all these things, it's like I can't just post. I could post a random story, but the ones I'm in contract for, I can't just like put it on the internet, which makes sense from their point of view. But for me, I'm like, oh, I miss those days. And then sometimes I'm like a little jaded where I'm like, oh, like, especially with the movie adaptations, I was like, oh, this was not necessarily a dream, but most authors, it's like the goal. And for me, after doing it 5 times, I'm like, you know what? Like, I actually prefer, I like adapting other people's stuff. I have my own imprint now, and I have my own
Mhm.
production company. So I started optioning other authors' books, and that's more fun.
Mhm.
But there are times where I miss the like simplicity and the just doing it for myself. But at the same time, I think in the reality, only 1% of us get to actually have a job that we love. So whenever I find myself thinking that way, I'm like, okay, do you want to like go back to trying to make ends meet and worrying about your electric getting turned off, or are you gonna like suck it up and write? So it's a pretty like easy time to bring myself back. But I definitely, there is something special about when you're not obligated or when you're not in a contract. I think that has to do with anything in life. It's like
Mhm.
when you have the choice, and I'm a very creative person, so I love to even create my own illusions of choice, like my deadlines. For example, if I have a deadline, I'll tell my agent, like, tell me a different day, like tell me it's due a different day, because I, for whatever reason, I think it comes from my mother, I cannot meet a deadline unless I'm like forced, and then I end up writing like the best thing that I've written if I have like no time to do it. So it's kind of like a game type of situation where I'm sure she hates it, but she pretends to love it. But I would say the biggest change is just like the obligations and the Zooms, but I still feel like I got to, because my career happens to organically, I still get to keep the like fluidity, and I get to, especially now having an imprint with Wattpad, it's like I get to have a hand in picking writers who maybe aren't, 20 years into this business and don't have connections and don't have an agent and don't have all of these things that the stereotypical writer should have. So I feel like I get the best of both worlds. I get the structure and the support from these big companies, but I also get to make choices in real time and have a say in the things that are important to me.
Your story, I mean, I'm fascinated by everything that you're telling us that you did, because it's I have a couple of questions. That what the team that you have around you now that you've created, because like you were saying, I mean, you were walking into these huge publishers that people would give their right arm to be, and almost you didn't know what was in front of you and what you were getting, which is so, I mean, such a lovely story and idea that you went into it with such an open mind. But how, and also I like when I call the Wattpad people and say, oh my God, you're so kind, and you're so, like, they could have been real jerks and they could have taken
Yeah.
advantage and they could have done so much. I mean, I'm like, they're such good people. um so what kind of team now have you created and put around you, because you were able to do that, like as after you had success, or as you had success, instead of, like you said, having to build up this team and trying to get there with an agent and with a manager. You got the success first. So how have you created your team around you now to help you as your career is growing so much? Like you said, you can't answer every person, and you're building your own business, and you're a writer. Well, how did you create the dream team that supports you now?
So I kept even though the structure and things at Wattpad have changed, obviously, but I've always have a little core group of people at Wattpad, even though some of the ones that were there a decade ago are not even there anymore, or they've started their own companies or all these things. And some have even like retired because of the success, which is great for them. But I've kept a very close relationship with the people at Wattpad, which is in the beginning, even though I didn't know it, and I don't think they realized it either. Were sort of acting as an agent in a way for me. And then Simon and Schuster, my editor, the very first editor I had there, he left, which is when I left, and he guided me a lot in the terms of like, what do I do next? Because I'm like, there's so many things, there's so many, do I self-publish, because I didn't like this idea of just like this big company owning my life, not Wattpad, but like a Simon and Schuster. But
Mhm.
now, even since then, Simon and Schuster has evolved so much and just kind of kept up with the times. But he guided me a lot, even finding a new editor because he was leaving and doing graphic novels. And then I was guided a lot by Wattpad and also just friends in the industry. I made a lot of author friends all over the board, where some are with these huge publishers. Some have been writing and publishing for 15 plus years at the time. Some were new, but very like took off immediately on self-publishing. So I took a lot of everyone's experiences around me kind of and weighed my options. And I knew one of the times I went to Simon and Schuster in the very beginning, I remember walking past this wall and it was like this baseball player's name and all of his books, but they weren't his books. And I was like, what on earth does, blah, blah, blah have to do with any of these books? And my editor at the time was like, oh, he has an imprint here. And I was like, what do you mean? And he's like, oh, he curates the books and we publish them. And I was like, that's interesting, because does he read them? Like, does he like care? Which obviously most people with imprints don't really, especially if they have like an athletic career that they're spending 99% of the time. But I was like, huh. So I kind of filed that away for later. And I remember saying like a little bit after that, I remember telling my friend, like, by the time I'm in my 40s, I want to have my own imprint, because I know what, especially women and readers, and I know what we're starving for, and I know what's not getting traditionally published, which again, there is this incredible world of self-publishing, but in reality, until very recently, a lot of these incredible books were not being sold in stores. So I can go into my local bookstore and find great books, but I can also go on the internet and find really, really great books that just don't have the exposure or the backing of the companies and the distribution and all this stuff. So I kind of had to figure out, without any experience, of how do I get distribution of books for, for example, like Kindle Unlimited. It's like, it's a very onerous kind of contract where you have to keep your books there. And I had tons of friends who are only publishing there. And some of them didn't care about having physical books, but some of them just for, especially as readers, it's like there is something so special about holding a book and going into a bookstore and seeing your book. It's like, it's not even a financial thing. It's just like a feeling that you have where it's just different for some people. For some people, it doesn't matter. But for some of my friends, I was like, how do we do this? So I researched a couple companies. I self-published one of my own books just to see if the distribution worked, and ended up with like 1,000 books sitting in a warehouse somewhere in Mississippi. And I was like, okay, well, that one didn't work. So let's try this again. So it was trial and error, but just like, again, there's some part of me, again, I think one of the good things I got from my mom is just like, I don't really doubt myself too often. And if something doesn't work out, it just doesn't work out. I feel like I have the like fear is missing in many ways in my brain, which is so far so good, knock on wood. But I was like, well, if it doesn't work, like I'll figure it out later. So it definitely didn't work at the time. And then I was like, okay, well, I need a backing for this. Like I can have an imprint, but I can't do it by myself. So I found an agent who was, again, within the Twilight community, where she was basically a developer in Brazil, a real estate developer, very successful company, was a small agent at the time. Now she's one of the biggest, and her specialty was foreign sales. So she would take her friends that she met in the Twilight fan fiction community that she was reading their books and then sell their rights to other countries. And she did it all on her own with no experience. She just was like, and at the time she wasn't even like taking money or anything. She just was like, I'm just doing it for fun because these are my friends. And I was like, okay. So I had met her a few times, and then I'm like, I wonder if we can try to make this work. Because I already had all the foreign publishers from the After series. I got very fortunate and got deals in, like 37, 38 countries. So I didn't necessarily need the foreign aspect, but I was like, I wonder if she can translate this, because I've never, even now, she's still my agent, and now she's my producing partner, and we're working on films together and doing all this. She can do anything, literally anything. And she has 3 daughters, 2 in college. It's like that woman literally can do anything. So I like latched onto her, and then she was like, okay, let's go to Wattpad and 2 of these other publishers that have been dying to work with you and talk about getting the structure for the imprint. And I was like, okay. So then we had meetings with all of them, but just made sense. Like Wattpad, it just made sense. It's like I already know them. I have a really great relationship with them. It's also an endless, like basically, I don't even know what the term, because there's so many stories there. Like it's an endless amount of content that we can choose from. And I made sure there's no limitations on it has to be on Wattpad or not. I have a lot more say when it comes to Wattpad because I've been there for so long and like helped make it so big. So I just felt, I was like, this just feels right to have the imprint with Wattpad. And now it's turned into this whole thing. We just had a book come out yesterday from an author. She started as a singer, but now turned author named Pia Mia.
Tell us her.
Yeah, her name is Pia Mia. And tonight she's having a signing at the Grove that I'm hosting. And this year alone, we've had her book and then another book come out in February. We have another one in June. And then my third book of the Brightest Stars series comes out in July. And we're announcing next year's slate soon. So it's like we're like a real imprint now. So it's really, really cool.
That's so exciting.
That's awesome.
That's amazing. So your conclusion of the Brightest Stars series, I wanted to ask, like with the after series and now concluding this, is it hard to conclude those series? Is it hard to kind of close those characters down? Do you have an end, when you start it, do you kind of know where it's going to end? How do you feel about that?
I usually know where it's going to end, but I always change it. So the ending that I think in the beginning is never, to this day, I've never actually had that ending that I think is going to be there. I would say I'm not very good at ending stories, which is why the after series is like a million words long. And even the conclusion of the Brightest Stars, I know I'm going to get some feedback on the ending because I was like, I could write another book. And then I'm like, no, because I have a contract for 2 other books that aren't announced yet. So I'm like, okay, maybe I'll do some bonus content in my email chain or something. But I love series as a reader, and I just love characters. And once I'm in their head, it's hard to get out of it. So it's like I could easily slip into the minds of the characters that I've been with for so long and write 10 more books. But I also, as a reader, know when you're overstaying your welcome and when you're not. So I'm like, okay, let's like kind of reel it in. But I would say it's been pretty hard to just end the stories because that's why I think I love fan fiction so much and reading it, because when the book series is over or the book is over, I can go on the internet and read 1,000 different scenarios and 1,000 different endings, and I can read 20 years later and I can read about their grandchildren and all of that. So I think that's why I'm so drawn to fan fiction, because I love to live in these worlds that I love as long as I can.
My favorite thing too, if I have a series that I love and it ends, and then you find the fan fiction, and I'm like, nope, yes, that's what I want to happen to him. So you like go down that road with him, because you're like, no, I'm not going to accept that that's what happens.
Yes, it's so fun, especially if the ending is something that you're like, what just happened? And then you can find like the ending that you want. But there are times where I read a fan fiction, I'm like, no, I'm erasing that from my memory of like, that would never happen, even though I know it's fan fiction, but I'm like, no, that fan fiction is out of my memory now.
Right. Or you're like, I won't accept that that's what happens to them.
Not at all.
I wanted to ask you a little bit. We follow you on social media and your blog, the blogs and stuff that you do. And you were at the LA Times Festival of Books, and then also I think the New York Public Library events. And I wanted to kind of touch on like those like in-person library and like like we were talking about, like those physical book events. You guys are doing a signing at the Barnes and Noble at the Grove, but how important are those in the New York Public Library events? And I love the LA Times Festival of Books is just such a huge event. What do those kinds of events mean to you and your fans, and now the new writers and authors that you're bringing up through your imprint?
I would say, honestly, meeting readers in person is one of the most important things. I think even just on an emotional level and a connection level, it's so different than one. I do believe that you can have a very close relationship through the internet, but it's just a different feeling. And especially when you get in a room full of especially for me when it's like, I'm on a tour. I personally like book tours and book signings more than those big conventions, because sometimes even as a reader, it's overwhelming and there's so much going on. But I will say the LA Times, I did 2 years in a row, and I love how much more romance there is now. I love seeing so many more indie bookstores getting a lot of space and a big impact there. So that for me is really cool. But it is like, you're like, okay, I have to choose between 20 different authors, and you're like rushed from one tent to another, but it's also shows the demand, which is also really cool. But I will say there's nothing like being in a bookstore with people who just not only love your work, but love books and love romance and love stories in general, because then you can see them creating friendships. And in my reader community, I have so many of them that have become real life friends, and they go on trips together, and they take like at least once a year, and they're from all over the country, and some of them in other countries, and they meet up. And I've had like one woman that was from Germany meet up with a girl from France, and then they became roommates. And I've had people that tell me, and they'll bring their parents, and they'll say like, I'm studying literature now, or I went into publishing. And when I was in Paris in October, I was just walking by this illustration shop, and this woman or girl, because I remembered her face, but she was grown up now, so that was confusing to me. But I had met her since she was 16, and as a fan, and now she's working at this publisher, and she's like a grown up. And I was like, wait, she was like, Anna, is that you? And I was like, wait, I know her, but I don't know her. It was very like really cool. But she was like, I've come to all of your sightings in France, and I've been going there since my first book came out. So watching her grow up, and then now she's like has this really incredible job at a publisher that she loves. And she's like a working woman out in the world, where when I met her, she was like this 16-year-old like book lover. So those kind of things are really cool to hear. It's really great to hear it, even if it's on the internet, but there is something special about that connection in person and feeling that bond, and seeing even sometimes if it's like the same person, and I like her, where it's like I have a few of them around the world where I've literally watched them grow up, and they've watched me grow up and go through so many life changes. And it's just really, really cool. And even for networking, for newer authors, I would say networking and meeting other authors and other even publishers. It's like, it's really good if you can get out to as many of those events, even if you aren't a people person or don't love social events. Once you get there and you realize like, oh, this isn't your typical networking, this is book people, it's way more fun.
We love them. We think that they're so fun. So for the Brightest Star series, I was looking at my notes, and I don't have this written down. If I read it, is there a plan for it to become a movie or a series, or that series to go on to another platform?
I can't say at the moment,
Okay.
but I will say that there's some activity going on, but I can't say what it is yet. But
so it's staying hidden. I couldn't find it.
Yeah, I'm like, good. I'm glad you couldn't find it yet.
And do you, when you're starting, because you said you have, you're finishing up this series, and then you've got other, now that that has happened, and it's, it's so like we're talking about the beginning of the podcast, it's so common now. Is that something you think about even as you start a new book, or you start a new series, like, oh, they're going to want it to be a series, or they're going to want it to be a movie? What does it look like visually? Is that now in the back of your head as you're starting?
Especially not so much the opinions of the readers, but the visual and the adapting of it, especially because I did start the production company, and the book that I'm finishing right now it's not announced yet either, so I can't say what it is or what it's about. But that one, we actually sold the idea to a studio before I had even written a word, which I don't recommend doing, especially if you're not a planner when it comes to your work. I'm really grateful that I could do that. But at the end, I was like, okay, wait. So we were like working on the script while I was writing the book. And it was just, I was like, but I changed my mind all the time. And then I just changed the ending, and they're like, okay. But so that one was pretty much, I had the storyline already in my head. But that one was pretty much made for adapting. And the story itself is really easily adapted, which a lot of things can be if you just get them in the right hands. It's not
Mhm.
that complicated, but sometimes you get, a group full of men who have no idea and they just think they can cash in on something you've created. And then that's when the craziness happens. But if
Mhm.
you get the right team of people, it's not that complicated to adapt a story. But I definitely think more in acts and in actions
Mhm.
and how it can be adapted. But that story specifically is a standalone, which is very weird for me. And I'm like, are we sure this is like, which I have the right, and especially because I'm in a position now where I can be like, actually, I want to add another book, but I'm going to try, even just as like an exercise for myself, to just keep it in one book and see what happens.
Yeah, yeah. No, I can imagine you grab onto the character. You're like, no, there's more.
Yeah. And I'm like, but I want to write about like their daily life and when they're older and this and that. But I'm like, maybe I'll save that. I keep being like, I'll just send out stuff in an email and my agent will be like, what do you mean? We could sell that.
Well, we have been talking. I can't. My thing just popped up. I can't believe we've been talking for almost an hour.
Oh my
We're
gosh.
this has gone so fast. So one of the things we like to find out with our when we're doing our podcast is you're obviously super busy. You have a child. You have all of this stuff going on. But is there anything outside of your own work that you're reading, watching, listening to that you're loving right now that you can share with us?
Yeah, so I still stay in like the romance space no matter what I'm doing in life, but I'm really, really into Korean dramas.
Oh.
So in Korea, they put a lot of money and production into romance, which I love. And it's done really, really well. So I watch Korean dramas like crazy. Like I have a list of recommendations on my Instagram highlights. Like I pretty much exclusively watch Korean content. I just watched the Maxton Hall. It's a German author who I know from Germany on Prime. It just came out.
Mm.
Um, I'm like, yeah, Prime. Sometimes I forget which streamer, but Prime. Um, I pretty much only watch Korean dramas, but I obviously, I think everyone in the world read Fourth Wing,
Yeah,
um,
that
and
was
Iron
so cool.
Flame. So I'm waiting on the third book of that. Um, I've been rewatching Sex in the City because now it's on Netflix, but I'm like having a massive identity crisis because I haven't watched it in like 10 years. And I'm like, what on earth? Like my views on all of the characters and I'm like, this is so, it's like, I feel like it as a woman now, because I was way different mindset and just totally, I'm like, okay, like my favorite character is my least favorite character, the couple I loved. Like, why on earth did I ever think this was like okay? There's
Yeah.
so much of it that's been really interesting for me, just psychologically, to analyze myself of like, why did I love that, or why didn't that like put a red flag? So I've been falling asleep to that at night because I can't fall asleep to Korean dramas because subtitles. And if you close your eyes, you're like rewinding it. So I've been watching like at least one or two episodes a night of Sex and City, and it's definitely interesting to
There's so
watch
many
now as a
articles.
35-year-old.
Yeah. There's so
Yeah.
many articles about exactly that and people's views and how it looks to a new generation watching it, but also, yeah, all of us that are watching it again. It's so crazy how the cultural, commentary is changing so much on that series. I love it. It's very
Yeah,
interesting.
I love it too. And even like female friendships. Like
Yeah.
when I watched it the first time, I didn't really have strong female friendships. And now that I do, I'm like, oh, this is like so like, I mean, especially Carrie, I'm like, what on earth? She's like the worst friend ever so many times, which I love that she's flawed. Like I wouldn't change her, but I'm like, why did I loved her and I used to find everyone else like, oh, they're wrong, poor Carrie. Now I'm like, oh, almost every episode she's like an awful friend and she's like totally not what I had in my mind. But here we are. And now that I'm in a very like loving, healthy relationship, I'm like, well, Aiden wasn't so boring. Actually, he's great. He's like stripping your floors. So I'm like, wow, I guess that's what happens when you like are in like a very healthy space. You're like, wait, Big's actually awful. And I love a bad boy, but now I'm like, oh, I
Yeah.
can't even stand him. Yeah.
I saw someone post the other day, like they were toxic from minute one. What were we all thinking?
Yeah, and I loved them. Like I tried to watch the new series and when they like, spoiler alert, when they like
Yeah.
got rid of him, I was like, I'm never watching this again. But now I'm like, well, actually I might love it because he's awful. So I think when I get through, I'm on season 5, but when I get through, and I've seen the movies over and over, so I'm not gonna
Yeah.
even put those in the middle, but I might give the new show a retry now that I'm not so team big.
It is funny. Well, Anna, thank you so much for joining us. This has been just such a great getting to know you, and excited for everything you're doing. I have to tell you, in my office, I've got piles of books that that we're talking about on the podcast, and my to be read piles all over, and your the first 2 books of the Brightest Stars series were sitting on my table, and my daughter, I have a high school daughter, and she comes in, she's always looking at them and flipping books over and looking, and she saw your book sitting there, and she was like, oh, this was a couple months ago or whatever when we first started reaching out, and she saw the Wattpad insignia on him, and she was like, that's so, before she even like looked at the title, looked at your name, she was like, oh my God, that's so cool. These books are from Wattpad, and, and knowing what they do and so it is still such and she's huge into anime and
I
into,
love that.
fan fiction of anime, and knowing she knew Wattpad, like before she knew the author, before she knew the title, before she, and she's like, oh, I always look for, for fan fiction or for self-publishing, as she's looking at everything about the book. And I think that's such an interesting, thing, because I don't know that I would ever like look at who the publisher is or look at that, and what your books have, what you've done for Wattpad has allowed them to go out into all of these genres, and making these young kids and these young creators notice that, for a book. And I thought it was just really, really interesting and really kind of a special look at things. So
No,
thank
I
you.
love that. I definitely I get that a lot, especially in other countries where they're like, you've made teenagers read, and
Yeah.
I'm like, well, they would be reading if you guys, these big publishers, were supplying them with stuff they actually want to read. So I feel
Mhm.
like Wattpad and Webtoon have made reading and publishing so much more of a democracy, which I love. Because
Yeah.
growing up
Yeah.
as a reader, it's like you only see the same names, and it used to be like 90% men, and it's like
Right.
romance funds 95% of the publishing industry. Why are we not talking about that? So I love that it's totally flipped on its head now because of things like Wattpad and Webtoon. I love it, and I'm so grateful to be a part of it.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe and leave a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. To stay up to date with In Her Words, join the conversation by following Women in Entertainment on our social channels, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter at womeninentertainment.com.